After the Fact, a podcast by Pew, keeps it real with data-driven insights on today's big issues. No spin, just facts, mixed with stories from experts, policymakers, and people making a difference. Whether you're into the research or the personal stories behind it, we've got you covered. So what are you waiting for? Listen to After the Fact wherever you get your podcasts. Today on CityCast DC, the DMV is front and center in the Trump administration's campaign to deport undocumented immigrants. So what does this mean for the region, and what do people here need to know about their rights in this legal landscape? We're talking with Atenas Burrola Estrada of the Amica Center for Immigrant Rights. Today is Monday, March 24th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hi, Atenas.
Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So it's been a busy time for you. Since taking office, President Trump has threatened ICE crackdowns. Just earlier this month, there was a raid in Nova. How have the threats from the president lined up with the actual actions so far?
They have both come through and they have not. One of the main purposes of the threats that the administration made about carrying out large-scale raids, about immigration enforcement, was fear. And in terms of that, it was very successful. The community is very afraid. A lot of people are very afraid. We have, in fact, seen significantly increased immigration enforcement, both here locally in the DC area as well as nationwide. However, the very large-scale threats of raids that they said were going to happen, for example, the day of the inauguration and that first week after the inauguration, those very large-scale raids did not happen. And so there both has been more enforcement and also just a lot of fear that has not necessarily been tied to enforcement.
And there's reporting that the president is unhappy with the pace of deportations.
Despite the fact that there are quotas now that ICE is racing to try to fill.
Well, I guess this is the other thing. This is not happening in a vacuum. We're at this moment in Washington where so many people in the city, so many of our neighbors are experiencing things traumatically. Maybe they're losing their jobs. Maybe they're worried about whether the school is going to have to lay off teachers because of the budget. There's all kinds of things going on. And this is sort of there in the hierarchy of priorities. And I can imagine people saying hey, I'm sorry, I can't make a priority out of this issue. These are folks who came to the country illegally, or in some cases at least. I'm worried about losing my job. I'm worried. I'm trying to fight them about eliminating my agency. So what do you say to that? Why should people prioritize this issue?
Well, the first thing now would be that the administration is targeting anybody who disagrees with them. And what is happening in the immigration sphere right now, I would argue, is the canary in the coal mine. It is what is alerting us to the fact that this administration does not seem to have any regard for the Constitution, for the laws of the United States, and instead is running rampant to retaliate, to target anybody who disagrees with them, who disagrees with their stance. We have seen this, for example, in the targeting of corporate law firms who represented Hillary Clinton or who represented Jack Smith, the counsel who was investigating President Trump. And what I speaking now, personally tell my friends is, obviously for me, this is what I do day in, day out. It is the important issue, but I don't think it's fair to expect that it be the most important issue for everyone. And so what I do ask is that people at least know the bare minimum and don't spread misinformation. If they can't donate their time, donate their money, volunteer for this, that's okay, because we've got a long 4 years ahead of us and we have to get through the 4 years, and we're not going to be able to do it by responding, all of us, to every single emergency. And so we have to choose what we are going to respond and spread ourselves out in a way such that hopefully we come out at the end of it.
So I think a lot of people, when they picture victims of the change in immigration enforcement, they think of, Salvadorans in a heavily Salvadoran neighborhood, maybe work in construction or run a restaurant or whatever. There's also, in Washington, there's a lot of universities, there's a lot of students, and all of a sudden there's a lot of fear about them getting detained or even deported regardless of their legal status. The story of the Columbia student that went viral, he had a green card. ICE officials said they were revoking his legal status when they arrested him as a student. Then last week, a Georgetown postdoc student was just arrested at his home in Arlington. What happened there?
What happened, as far as we can tell, the administration determined that this student was deportable under actually the same statute as the Columbia student and detained him for participating in quote unquote illegal activity, which his attorney vehemently denies. And as far as anyone can tell thus far, the activity may or may not be related to his wife being Palestinian American. What the administration is saying is that he, quote, was spreading Hamas propaganda and promoting anti-Semitism on social media. In fact, he does not have any criminal record. He has not been charged with any crime. However, in order to use the provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the person has to have done something that makes them deportable, right? Which is how the Secretary of State supposedly makes this determination. But as far as we can tell, it seems that, what they have used to decide that this person is a threat to the country's foreign policy is their social media in support of Gaza and or, perhaps an extrapolation of his wife's familial connections.
Who's an American citizen?
Correct.
And as an American citizen, I could go on social media, I could spread Hamas propaganda, I could be anti-Semitic, I could do all kinds of terrible things that are my rights under the Constitution. But I guess it's not anymore the right of someone who's here on a student visa, at least according to this administration.
The First Amendment is one of the most broad-ranging constitutional protections that protects free speech. It is not necessarily tied to status, right? We saw that the Columbia student who was arrested, he is a lawful permanent resident. He is a green card holder, and they are using the same arguments to arrest and try to deport him.
So this arrestee, he has a student visa, not a green card. And that's an even riskier spot. Do you have a sense of how many students in D.C. are here on that kind of visa?
So the students at DC's colleges and universities who are considered international students, which means for the most part that they are on a student visa, is 11,944. That is probably a lower number if one considers the individuals like the Columbia student who is actually a green card holder, so he would not be counted under that. But we do have almost 12,000 people in DC schools who are on student visas.
Okay, so zooming out a little bit beyond just students, is there a rough estimate of how many immigrants and refugees, or I guess foreigners in general, are in the DC area?
So Maryland and Virginia each have about 1 million immigrants each. DC, just the city of DC, has about 94,000. It is a not insignificant number of the population, from 13 to 17% of the population of either the state or the city. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of immigrants that we have here, both documented and undocumented in the area. Between Maryland and Virginia, there's a little over 500,000 immigrants. This is undocumented immigrants that I'm looking at.
So bottom line, there's a little more than 2 million people by my count. And of those, about 500,000 are not here legally and are therefore at a particular risk.
That is correct. That being said, it is not only undocumented immigrants who are at risk. We have seen the administration targeting people who have, for example, temporary protected status, what's commonly known as TPS. We've seen the administration targeting people who are actively seeking asylum. So not just the individuals who are, traditionally considered to be, quote unquote, living in the shadows, the undocumented, unknown population.
Can you explain what TPS is?
Yeah, it's temporary protected status. So it is, as the name implies, a temporary status that allows people to remain in the country legally. It protects them from deportation, gives work authorization, and there are populations that have had TPS for many, many years. For example, a large portion of Salvadorans in the DC and the broader DMV area have had TPS for many years.
The idea, just so I understand, was like at some point in history, there was, a catastrophe emergency in their country. The United States let people in under this temporary status, but that status could be revoked if we decide everything's hunky dory.
So it is a status that is based on country. People are not allowed into the United States with TPS. It is for individuals who are already in the United States, and the United States determines that there is some sort of unrest or danger. It could be related to climate, it could be related to politics in that population's home country. That means it's too dangerous for them to return. And so it provides this temporary authorization, which the administration can choose to continue renewing or not.
It may be too soon to know, but are there specific areas of the DMV that seem to be getting targeted or may be targeted?
Honestly, it's all over the place. We're seeing a lot of enforcement in Northern Virginia, in Maryland, in DC. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of rhyme or reason to it, aside from obviously immigrant heavy communities, immigrant heavy parts of cities, of places. What we haven't seen thus far is these kind of large scale, what are more typically known as raids, where, for example, dozens of people are arrested at a time, where there's an ICE enforcement action at a factory, for example, that ICE goes in, arrests a large number of people. We haven't really seen that kind of large scale enforcement. It does seem to be more targeted to neighborhoods and to picking up smaller numbers of individual, a lot of them, but more,
Like, where's it happening? Is it in certain kinds of establishments, bars, schools, churches? I don't.
people are getting picked up on the street. They're getting picked up at their homes. They're getting picked up coming out of their homes, at work, at courthouses, really all over the place.
So they might be in court for some other reason, traffic,
They
something.
might be in court for traffic, for maybe something else, and they get picked up coming out of court. I would say we haven't heard reliable reports of any immigration related arrests happening around schools. That I think is not a line that has been crossed yet. Hopefully it won't be, but certainly out and about pretty much everywhere else.
So help us out. Can you explain? I mean, there's talk of raids, and I think we all sort of have maybe a picture in our head from TV. But what does an ICE raid actually look like? Do they like bang down the doors of people who they suspect are undocumented, or is it like we're going to run an extra check when we got you for a traffic stop anyway?
So the difficult thing here is that there isn't a accepted or a communal understanding of what a raid is. Everyone kind of uses raid differently. I would say historically, an understanding of a raid had been where a larger number of people had been arrested in one go. So it was a raid at a factory, it was a raid at a construction site, it was a raid at an apartment complex, for example, where there were a lot of people arrested together. That is not so much what we're seeing here. What we're seeing might be, for example, I live in Columbia Heights, and about a month or so ago, there were reports that ICE was going around apartment complexes in Columbia Heights, knocking on doors. And then if somebody opened the door, asking about their immigration status, or saying that they were looking for a certain person. So that was happening here. We have seen the Migrant Mutual Aid and Solidarity Network. It's the local DC network that's tracking immigration enforcement. They have a hotline that people can call, and when they are able to confirm that there is ICE activity, they will post, for example, we have confirmed 3 ICE cars at X location. doing something. So that is, the type of enforcement that we're seeing more often right now. When people get arrested by ICE after, for example, a traffic offense, that is not necessarily at the moment of the traffic offense. What might happen is, for example, somebody gets pulled over for not having a license, their information is run, and when the police run that information, it gets sent to ICE, and then ICE can go look for that person. So they know, for example, when that person is going to go to traffic court, and they can be waiting for them when they walk out of traffic court.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
So there have been these questions about DC's sanctuary city status lately. The city had a webpage about it, and the page has gone missing. Mayor Bowser distanced herself from this language surrounding it. Can you just give me the quick definition? What does it mean to be a so-called sanctuary city?
Broadest level, what it means is that the city, particularly local law enforcement, does not cooperate with ICE. It means different things specifically in different cities because it depends on local laws that are passed. So, for example, here in DC, what that means is that DC law enforcement will not honor what is called an ICE detainer, which is a request by ICE for local law enforcement to continue detaining somebody once they have fulfilled the reason that they are being detained. So, for example, if they were arrested after a traffic stop, or if they, served a couple of days in jail, if ICE has reason to believe that that person doesn't have status or has, done something such that they should be arrested and placed into immigration court proceedings, ICE can send what's called a detainer, which asks that jurisdiction to keep that person in jail or in prison until ICE comes get them. And so the DC law says that DC law enforcement will not do that because it disincentivizes the immigrant community from working with law enforcement and from seeking protection from law enforcement if they think that it might lead to an ICE arrest.
So that is a law. Like, you can't just take that down like a webpage.
It was something that was passed by the city council. The fact that the webpage is gone doesn't mean that that has gone away. It just means perhaps that the city doesn't want to advertise it anymore.
So there's a lot of Republicans who argue that sanctuary status makes a city less safe for all residents. Just to use this example you just used, it makes it more likely that people will be driving without a license, which you're not supposed to do, which we don't want people to do. But writ large, what do you say to that argument?
There's actually been a decent amount of reputable studies that have shown that cities that have so-called sanctuary policies actually are safer than cities they don't. They have lower levels of crime. They are the cities that often allow undocumented people to also get licenses. So you have less amount of people driving without a license. They are able to get a license so they can drive legally. They can get insurance. They can register their cars. They're likely paying taxes, as all undocumented immigrants do, right? So the research generally has not played out or has not supported the rhetoric that a sanctuary city is less safe than cities that are not having those kinds of policies.
So I get why a mayor of Washington, with the threats against home rule, with the issues around the budget, with Congress, would not want to keep that website up. It's like waving a red flag, at the bull. But do you get the sense that this means, that any of these changes mean that DC, at the part of DC that we locals run, will be less hospitable to immigrants and particularly to people who are not here legally?
I don't think so. I think Mayor Bowser is in a really difficult situation right now, as you said, in trying to protect home rule and trying to do whatever is possible to at least slow down these attacks that are very clearly coming against DC's ability to govern ourselves. But I do believe that the city council, that the mayor still believes that DC values are, considering all DC residents as important and defending DC residents and protecting DC residents. I have not seen an indication that, for example, what's going on in Virginia, where the Virginia governor has ordered that local law enforcement start cooperating with immigration and wants local law enforcement to be essentially deputized to be able to be immigration officers. We have not seen that happen here in DC. Hopefully, we will not. It is a different political environment here than it is in Virginia. But frankly, I think it does make sense, as you said, to stop waving a red flag in front of the bull so that we can protect ourselves.
And like you say, in my experience, cops are pretty eager to not change this because it makes it harder to get people to be witnesses against, murderers and rapists and stuff.
Exactly. If the immigrant community is afraid of calling the cops because they think it might lead to somebody's deportation, that's not in anybody's best interest. And it doesn't only affect immigrants, right? 1 in 5 children-ish in the area have a family member who is undocumented. 1 in 5 U.S. citizen children in the area have a family member who is undocumented. So it might not even be that the person who is in need of help from the police is afraid for themselves, but rather afraid from a family member, for a neighbor, for their community. And so I think it is in everybody's best interest that people trust law enforcement, local law enforcement, right? And that is really what these kinds of policies foster, is trust between the community and local law enforcement.
So I would just like to talk about what would it mean for DC if these kinds of crackdowns, raids, deportations became a more regular feature of life?
It would have a pretty devastating effect on the city. I don't like to talk only about immigrants as the economic impact that they have, but economically and for the workforce, for the amount of money that is spent in the district, it would have a tremendous impact. Nationwide, generally speaking, immigrants are disproportionately represented in industries like construction, like home building, like the restaurant industry. So it would have, a devastating effect on our economy in terms of labor. It also has a ripple impact beyond that, right? Because immigrants don't exist in silos. They live with family members who are lawful permanent residents, who are U.S. citizens. What happens to the children, the U.S. citizen children of somebody who is perhaps an undocumented parent or a documented one? There's a lot of people who live in mixed status families. So it would have really a devastating effect. And not just, I think it's really important to emphasize, not just for documented immigrants. DC, and actually DC, Maryland, and Virginia, the highest percentage as of 2023 of immigrants that we had in the area was people from El Salvador. A lot of those people have TPS, have temporary protected status. We have already seen the Trump administration trying to ending actually TPS for other countries like Venezuela. And in the prior Trump administration, we saw that they also tried to end TPS for other countries like El Salvador and Honduras. And so if this population who has been in the district for literal decades, right, they own restaurants, they own stores, they own all sorts of businesses, that is documented, they are not undocumented, that would also have a devastating effect throughout our communities.
So you are an attorney, but you do these sessions with people to help people understand their rights so that they know what happens in that moment when you're in crisis and you don't actually have your lawyer right next to you. So what can immigrants who are vulnerable or refugees locally do to prepare themselves?
So one of the most important things that I always say is making sure that people know their rights. As you said, we do these presentations to know your rights. And I think the community is doing a really good job of spreading the word and making sure that people do know their rights. One thing that I always like to share is that it's actually, in my opinion, really important for everyone to understand these rights, not just for the undocumented or at-risk population. Because if somebody who is a US citizen, for example, doesn't know what their rights are and allows ICE to violate those rights, then that can in and of itself out somebody who is undocumented. And I'll give an example. So what we have seen in the past in a workplace raid, for example, is that ICE will go to a workplace, say, we don't have many or any perhaps in this area, but like a chicken factory. I'm thinking like in Iowa, they had these. ICE will show up and what they will say is, all right, people who have papers, go to the left, and people who don't have papers, go to the right. Nobody is under any obligation to move, regardless of whether they have papers or whether they don't. But if only the individuals who don't have papers know that, and the individuals who do have papers move, they have inadvertently outed the people who don't have papers. Right? And so that's why I would say it's very important for everybody to know their rights, because everybody has the same rights to a certain extent under the Fourth Amendment in terms of ICE enforcement, in terms of ICE actions. For example, if you are in your home, you do not have to open the door. If any law enforcement official is banging on your door, unless they have a judicial warrant, which means that it is signed by a judge. ICE does not often have judicial warrants. They have a Department of Homeland Security document that says warrant, but it's not signed by a judge. So it's not a valid judicial order that somebody must honor and must open the door. So it is very scary to have somebody banging on your door saying, you have to open the door, law enforcement. So it's really, really important that everybody know that they have no obligation to do that.
So I'm a reporter, and at one of the papers I used to work at, they gave us all this little card we could stick in our wallet, which had, the language of the state open meetings law on one side and, our lawyer's number on the other. If you were making such a card, it sounds like you don't have to open the door, you don't have to move. Are there any other things you would put on that card that people should carry around and just know for themselves?
Don't answer any questions, aside from your name. You generally do want to identify yourself to a law enforcement officer. The laws vary by state and by city as to whether you are obligated to. So generally speaking, personally, I tell people at least say your name. But beyond that, invoke the right to remain silent for everybody. They're called little red cards is what they're commonly known as nowadays that for example, we have them at the office. A lot of other organizations are filling them out, and they're what you just described. They have a bullet point of 4 bullet points. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to answer any questions. Am I under arrest? Can I go? And we're encouraging people to carry those around, not just those who are undocumented or at risk, but everyone should carry them around because nobody should be answering these questions unless ICE has a valid judicial warrant.
So other than knowing their rights, what can sympathetic neighbors, allies, etc., do to help people in this in rough circumstances?
I think it's really important that people educate themselves, know what is going on, know what the potential impacts are. A lot of people say something, well, why doesn't somebody just get in line to get their status, to fix their status? Even people who are sympathetic. And the reality is that there is no line. right? If people could just get in line to get status, people would. People are not out here without status because they want to be. It's because there is no choice. Another thing that people can do if they are so inclined and if they have the resources is volunteer. Donate their time or their money to the organizations that are helping to support these individuals. There's a lot of mutual aid that's going on in the city. If you can't volunteer or if you can't donate your money, donate your time, donate some food, donate an hour, and educate others. Spread the word amongst your community of what's going on. Make sure that, if you have learned that you don't have to open the door, make sure that your neighbors also know that they don't have to open the door. And if you are in or around an impacted community, see how you can help that impacted community, right? If you live in an immigrant neighborhood, if you have immigrant friends, if you believe that there are people around you who might be at risk and you have that relationship with them, see what they need.
You mentioned donating time or money. Let me just ask, are there specific organizations that you would steer people towards if they want to do that?
Well, in blatant self-interest, I would encourage individuals to donate to the organization that I work for, the Amica Center for Immigrant Rights. But beyond that, I encourage people to search out their organizations locally. If they don't live in DC, there's organizations in Maryland, there's organizations in Virginia that are doing work. I really encourage people to try to, when they're donating money, donate locally. So to the smaller organizations or to the organizations that are doing local work, because a smaller donation can have a much bigger impact than donating to something like the ACLU, which is not to say the ACLU isn't doing amazing work. They are, but they're also getting a lot of money for it, whereas some of these smaller organizations are not, and particularly those of us who are also being threatened with loss of federal funding.
Atenas, thank you so much for being here.
Of course, I'm very happy. Thank you for having me.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you learned something from today's show, please forward it to your neighbors. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.